Atlanta, 1982. A 19-year-old college student vanished on her way home from campus. For 7 years, her mother waited, her hope a lonely candle against a cold, silent darkness. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no idea that the answer to the city's quietest mystery was hidden in a wooden box just beneath the bed of an unassuming stranger. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The autumn of 1982 painted Atlanta in hues of gold and rust, a crisp, hopeful season that mirrored the life of 19-year-old Kesha Monroe. The world, for her, was a sprawling map of possibilities, and she was standing at the starting line, eager to begin the journey. Her days were a study in determined motion, a rhythm of classes at Spelman College, late-night study sessions in the library, and the comforting, unwavering presence of her mother, Martha. Their home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of South Atlanta was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary of warmth and encouragement. The air inside always seemed to hold the scent of Martha's cooking yeast rolls, sweet potato pie, and the faint, comforting aroma of old books and freshly laundered sheets. It was a house filled with laughter, with the music of earth, wind, fire spilling from a small record player in the living room, and with the quiet, powerful bond between a mother and her only daughter. Kesha was a young woman woven from threads of strength and curiosity. She carried a profound sense of purpose, a belief instilled by Martha that she was meant to do more than just exist. She was meant to contribute, to learn, to grow. She was a sociology major, fascinated by the intricate patterns of human connection and the invisible structures that shaped people's lives. Her textbooks were filled with highlighted passages and notes scribbled in the margins, questions she posed to the world and to herself. She dreamed of working with community programs, of being a force for positive change in the city that had raised her. "You have a good heart, Kesha," Martha would tell her, her hands busy braiding Kesha's long, thick hair. "But a good heart isn't enough. You have to have a smart head to protect it." Martha Monroe was the bedrock of Kesha's world. She was a woman of deep faith and even deeper resilience, having raised Kesha on her own with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers nimble and sure, transforming simple fabrics into beautiful dresses. Her love for Kesha was a fierce, protective thing, a constant presence that was both a shield and a launching pad. She encouraged Kesha's independence but always reminded her of the importance of caution. "The world is a beautiful place, baby," she'd say, her voice soft but firm as they sat on the porch swing, watching the evening settle over the neighborhood. "But not everyone in it has beautiful intentions. You just have to be wise, keep your eyes open." Kesha, brimming with the natural confidence of youth, would smile and nod. She understood. She was careful. She was smart. She walked with her keys laced through her fingers at night and never took shortcuts through unfamiliar alleys. She felt secure in her world, cocooned by the love of her mother and the familiar embrace of her community, a community of watchful neighbors, of fellow church members who felt like family, and of friends she'd known since childhood. On a particular Tuesday in late October, the air held the first real chill of the coming winter. Kesha had spent the afternoon in the campus library, finishing a paper on urban development. The weight of her canvas tote bag, heavy with books, felt satisfying on her shoulder. It was the weight of progress, of a future being built one page at a time. She called her mother from a payphone on campus. The conversation, a familiar, comforting ritual. "I'm heading to the bus stop now, Mama," she said, her voice bright. "Should be home in about an hour. Is there anything you need me to pick up from the store?" "No, baby. I've got dinner covered. Just get yourself home safe," Martha replied, her voice a warm melody over the line. "I made your favorite, chicken and dumplings. You're the best. See you soon. Love you. I love you more." That was the last time Martha would hear her daughter's voice for 7 years. As Kesha walked toward the bus stop, she felt a sense of contentment. The paper was done, dinner was waiting, and the weekend was just a few days away. She was thinking about a new Stevie Wonder song she'd heard on the radio, humming the tune under her breath. The street was quiet, bathed in the soft, hazy glow of the setting Sunday. She barely noticed the plane. Beige sedan parked a little ways down the street, or the man sitting inside. He was just part of the scenery, another unremarkable detail in a perfectly ordinary day. She didn't see him as a threat. Why would she? He looked like someone's father, a man in his 40s with a tired face and nondescript clothes. He was invisible, a gray man who blended into the background of the world. Her mother's words about caution were a distant echo, a warning for a different kind of person, a different kind of danger. The danger she was about to face didn't announce itself with a menacing shadow or a sudden act of aggression. It would begin with a polite smile and a seemingly kind offer, a mask of normalcy so perfect that by the time it slipped, it would be far too late. The life of promise that stretched before her was about to be stolen, not in a dark alley, but in the fading light of a peaceful autumn evening. The wait for the bus was usually a time for Kesha to decompress, to let the structured world of academia fall away and allow her mind to wander. She'd watch the cars go by, the people on their way home from work, and feel a part of the city's steady, rhythmic pulse. On that evening, however, the air grew heavy as the sky shifted from orange to a deep, bruised purple. A sudden, unexpected drizzle began to fall, cold and sharp. She pulled her jacket tighter, shifting the weight of her heavy book bag. The bus was late. She glanced at her watch, a small silver piece her mother had given her for her 19th birthday. 10 minutes past its scheduled arrival. It wasn't unusual, but the cooling rain made the delay feel more significant. It was then that the beige sedan pulled up to the curb beside her. The passenger side window rolled down with a quiet whir. The man inside, the same nondescript man she'd barely noticed before, leaned over. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice even and polite. "Looks like this rain is starting to come down pretty good, and this bus can be unreliable. I'm heading down toward the Campbellton Road area. Could I offer you a ride to stay out of this weather?" Kesha hesitated. Every warning her mother had ever given her flickered in her mind. Never get in a car with a stranger. But the man didn't look like a threat. He looked ordinary, almost fatherly. His car was clean but unremarkable. He wasn't pushy or aggressive. He seemed, more than anything, genuinely concerned. "Oh no, thank you. I'm sure the bus will be here any minute," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Suit yourself," he said with a slight shrug, not pressing the issue. He started to roll up the window, then paused. "It's just, my own daughter is about your age, goes to Clark College. I'd hate to think of her standing out in a cold rain like this. It's no trouble at all, really." He had said the magic word, daughter. It was a small detail, a simple, disarming piece of information that subtly reframed him in her mind. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a father. A man who understood the world from a protective, parental perspective. Her internal alarm, which had been buzzing faintly, began to quiet down. The rain was getting heavier now, soaking through her jacket. "Well, I'm going just off Campbellton," she found herself saying, the practical desire to be warm and dry overriding the vague sense of caution. "See? No problem at all." "Hop in," he said, his smile gentle. He reached over and pushed the passenger door open for her. With a final, fleeting moment of doubt, she climbed in, pulling her heavy bag onto her lap. "Thank you so much, sir. This is very kind." "Not at all. Happy to help," he said, pulling smoothly away from the curb. His name, he told her, was Leonard Price. The first few minutes of the drive were entirely normal. He asked her about her major, what she was studying. He seemed interested, nodding along as she spoke about her sociology paper. He mentioned his daughter again, saying she was studying nursing. He created a bubble of comfortable, ordinary conversation. Kesha began to relax, chiding herself for her initial hesitation. This man was just a nice person doing a good deed. It was the first wrong turn that pricked her newfound sense of ease. He turned left where he should have continued straight. "Oh, I usually take the next street up," she said, her voice casual, trying not to sound alarmed. "Just a little shortcut, I know," Leonard said smoothly. "Avoids that traffic light up ahead. It's always a long one." It was a plausible explanation. But the next turn took them further away from the main road, into a quieter residential area she didn't recognize. The houses were smaller, the streetlights fewer and farther between. The bubble of normalcy popped, and the cold dread she had initially suppressed came rushing back, sharp and suffocating. "I think "I think you should just let me out here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't the right way." Leonard's demeanor shifted. The gentle, fatherly smile vanished, replaced by a calm, chilling impassivity. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "We're almost there," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it had held just moments before. Panic seized her. She reached for the door handle. It was locked. She fumbled with the manual lock, but it wouldn't budge. He must have controlled it from his side. "Please, let me out," she said, her voice rising. He didn't answer. He just kept driving, his silence more terrifying than any threat. The world outside the car windows became a blur of unfamiliar houses and dark, empty streets. She was trapped. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a kind stranger. This wasn't a helpful father. This was a predator, and she had walked right into his trap. Back at the Monroe home, Martha was starting to worry. An hour had passed, then 90 minutes. The chicken and dumplings sat warm on the stove. She called Kesha's best friend, who hadn't heard from her since they left the library. She called another classmate. Nothing. With each call, the knot in her stomach tightened. Kesha was never late without calling. Never. By the time 2 hours had passed, the worry had curdled into a raw, visceral fear. She stood at the front window, peering into the darkness, praying to see the familiar shape of her daughter walking up the path. But the street remained empty. The rain continued to fall, washing over a world that suddenly felt cold, hostile, and terrifyingly empty. The vanishing had been silent, seamless, and complete. The first call to the Atlanta Police Department was a lesson in procedural calm against a storm of maternal panic. Martha's voice was frayed, her words tumbling over one another as she tried to explain that her daughter, her Kesha, was missing. The dispatcher on the other end was professional, asking the standard questions in a measured tone. Age? Height? What was she last seen wearing? Was it like her to be out of touch? No, Martha insisted, her voice cracking. It wasn't like her at all. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, primal certainty that this was not a case of a young woman simply losing track of time. The initial police response was prompt, but lacked the urgency Martha felt. A patrol car arrived, and 2 officers took her statement. They were polite, even sympathetic, but the underlying assumption was clear. A 19-year-old girl was most likely out with friends, or with a boyfriend Martha didn't know about. They promised to file a report and keep an eye out. It wasn't until the next morning, when Kesha still hadn't returned, that the case was assigned to a detective. Her name was Lorraine Baldwin, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator in her early 30s, known around the precinct as Rainey. She had a reputation for being meticulous and for having a particular tenacity when it came to cases involving missing persons. Detective Baldwin met with Martha at her home. She walked into Kesha's bedroom, which Martha had left untouched, and saw a space that was a perfect portrait of the young woman who inhabited it. Textbooks were stacked neatly on the desk, a half-finished sketch of a bird lay on a drawing pad, and a well-loved teddy bear sat propped against the pillows. This wasn't the room of someone who had planned to run away. This was the room of someone who had expected to come home. Rainey listened intently as Martha recounted every detail of the previous day, her grief now overlaid with a steely resolve. She didn't just see a distraught mother. She saw a credible witness who knew her daughter's character inside and out. The detail about Kesha's reliability, her focus on her studies, and her close relationship with her mother painted a picture that contradicted the easy explanation of a young adult acting out. The investigation began in earnest. Rainey and her team canvassed the area around the bus stop, but no one had seen anything unusual. They interviewed Kesha's friends, professors, and classmates. A consistent picture emerged. Kesha was a responsible, well-liked young woman with no known enemies, no secret life, no reason to disappear. They checked bus logs and spoke to drivers, but no one remembered seeing her. The rain on the evening she vanished had kept most people indoors, and memories of a single face at a bus stop were hazy at best. The search felt like trying to grasp at smoke. There were no clues, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate where she might have gone. Days turned into a week. Martha, aided by her church community, organized search parties. They printed flyers with Kesha's smiling face and plastered them on telephone poles, in shop windows, and at bus stations all over the city. Her face was on the local news, her story a brief, tragic headline that was soon replaced by the next day's events. Detective Baldwin felt a growing sense of frustration. It was as if Kesha Monroe had simply evaporated. The lack of any physical evidence was the most maddening part. No abandoned purse, no dropped book, no disturbed ground. In a city the size of Atlanta, a person couldn't just vanish without leaving some trace. Yet, Kesha had. The police explored every possible avenue. They looked into local criminals, checked hospital and morgue records, and followed up on dozens of false leads, vague sightings from well-meaning people who thought they saw a girl who looked like Kesha in a different part of town. Each lead would spark a brief, agonizing flicker of hope in Martha's heart, only to be extinguished when it led nowhere. The investigation was a slow, grinding process of elimination, but they weren't getting any closer to an answer. The beige sedan Kesha had gotten into was a ghost. Without a license plate number or a more detailed description of the driver, it was just one of thousands of similar cars in the city. The man, Leonard Price, was a phantom. His name was common, and with nothing more to go on, running a check was like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. Rainey Baldwin found herself returning to the file late at night, long after the rest of the precinct had gone quiet. She would stare at the photo of Kesha, at her bright, hopeful eyes, and feel a personal sense of failure. She was a professional, trained to maintain a level of detachment, but some cases burrowed under the skin. This was one of them. The sheer absence of information was its own kind of presence, a silent testament to a crime that had been executed with chilling perfection. The search was not just frustrating. It was a baffling, maddening puzzle with all the key pieces missing. A month after Kesha's disappearance, the frantic energy of the initial search began to fade, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The news crews stopped calling. The search parties grew smaller, their hopeful chants turning into somber, quiet walks. The flyers with Kesha's face began to curl and bleach in the sun, her smile slowly fading from the public consciousness. For the city of Atlanta, the story of the missing college student was becoming old news. But for Martha Monroe, time had stopped on that rainy October evening. Her world had split into two distinct periods, the vibrant, colorful life she had known before, and the gray, silent emptiness of the after. She continued to go to work, her hands moving with the practiced muscle memory of her trade, but her mind was elsewhere. She was trapped in a ceaseless loop of what-ifs, replaying her last conversation with Kesha, searching for a clue she might have missed, a word that could have changed everything. The police investigation slowed to a crawl. Detective Baldwin, despite her personal commitment to the case, was forced to allocate her time to newer, more active investigations. The Kesha Monroe file remained on her desk, a thick manila folder that grew heavier with each passing week of inaction. It was now officially a cold case. "We haven't given up, Martha," Rainey would tell her during their weekly phone calls. "We're still following any leads that come in. But there's just nothing new to report." Martha understood, but the words did little to ease the ache in her soul. She knew the police had other responsibilities, other families to help. But Kesha was her only responsibility, her only family. And so, Martha became the sole keeper of her daughter's memory, a lone lighthouse keeper guarding a flame against a relentless tide of forgetting. She refused to change anything in Kesha's room. The bed remained made, the sociology textbook still open on the desk, a silent testament to a life interrupted mid-sentence. Some well-meaning friends from church had gently suggested that perhaps it was time to pack things away, to create a space for herself to move forward. Martha had politely but firmly refused. To pack away Kesha's things would feel like an admission of defeat, a surrender to the idea that her daughter was never coming home. And that was a reality she could not, would not, accept. Her hope was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, stubborn, and deeply personal act of faith. Every Sunday, she would say a prayer for Kesha's safe return in front of her congregation. And every year, on Kesha's birthday, she would buy a single, bright yellow balloon, Kesha's favorite color. She would walk to the park near their home, a place where Kesha had spent countless childhood afternoons on the swings, and she would release the balloon into the sky. She would watch it climb higher and higher, a small, vibrant speck against the vastness of the blue, and she would whisper the same message into the wind. "I'm still here, baby. I'm waiting for you." The years began to stack one on top of the other, each one a fresh layer of silent grief. 1983, 1984, 1985. The world moved on. The music changed, the fashions changed, the city of Atlanta itself grew and transformed. But in Martha's small, quiet house, time remained frozen. The silence was the loudest sound, a constant, humming presence that filled every room. It was the silence of a phone that never rang with the right voice, the silence of an empty chair at the dinner table, the silence of a future that had been stolen. For Detective Baldwin, the Monroe case file became a benchmark of frustration in her career. She was promoted, took on new responsibilities, and solved other complex cases. But Kesha's face, smiling out from that faded flyer, was a constant, haunting reminder of the one that got away. It was a symbol of the chilling reality of her profession. That sometimes people could just disappear, swallowed whole by the world, leaving behind nothing but a void of unanswered questions. The cold silence of the case was not just an absence of leads. It was an active, mocking presence, a puzzle she could never quite put out of her mind. The silence was absolute. No demands were ever made. No body was ever found. No clues ever surfaced. It was a perfect void, a testament to a crime committed by a ghost. But while the world fell silent, Martha Monroe continued to listen. She listened for a footstep on the porch, for a key in the lock, for a voice calling out, "Mama, I'm home." Her hope was the only thing that filled the crushing silence, a quiet, unwavering belief that one day, the silence would be broken. While the world above spun on oblivious, Kesha Monroe's universe had shrunk to the suffocating confines of a wooden box. It was roughly 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and just under 3 feet high, a space meticulously designed to hold a human being, but not to allow for any meaningful movement. It was her world, her home, her prison. The box was kept under a large, heavy bed in the master bedroom of a modest suburban house owned by Leonard and Dolores Price. The first few weeks, or had it been months, time had become a thick, viscous thing where a blur of confusion and terror. After the initial abduction, Leonard had brought her to this house, his demeanor shifting from the cold impassivity in the car to a strange, almost paternalistic authority. He explained the rules with a chilling calmness. She was not to make a sound. She was to remain in the box unless he permitted her to come out. She would be given food and water, and a small bucket for sanitation, which would be emptied once a day. Her world became a symphony of muted sounds, filtered through the wood and the mattress above. The creak of floorboards was the herald of a new day, the footsteps of Leonard or his wife, Dolores, moving about the room. The muffled drone of a television, the distant ringing of a telephone, the faint sound of a vacuum cleaner, these were her only connections to a life that seemed a million miles away. The darkness was near total, broken only by the thin slivers of light that crept through the cracks in the floorboards or the faint glow that sometimes outlined the lid of the box when the bedroom light was on. Her senses, starved of input, began to play tricks on her. She would see shifting patterns in the darkness, hear phantom whispers in the silence. Her own breathing, the thumping of her own heart, became the deafening soundtrack of her existence. Dolores was a ghost in this new reality. Kesha rarely saw her, but she heard her. Her footsteps were lighter than Leonard's, her voice a low, infrequent murmur. In the beginning, Kesha held on to the desperate hope that Dolores might be an ally, a potential savior. She tried, on one of the few occasions she was allowed out of the box in the dead of night, to plead with the woman, her eyes begging for a flicker of empathy. But Dolores's face was a mask of detached compliance. She would not meet Kesha's gaze. She moved with a robotic efficiency, helping Leonard with the grim logistics of Kesha's confinement. Her silence was a form of complicity, an invisible wall that was as impenetrable as the wooden one that surrounded Kesha. The physical discomfort was immense. Her muscles atrophied from lack of use. Her joints ached with a deep, constant pain. The air in the box was stale and stagnant, but the physical ordeal paled in comparison to the psychological one. The isolation was a slow, corrosive acid, eating away at her sense of self. The vibrant, intelligent college student began to fade, replaced by a terrified, compliant creature whose entire existence was dictated by the whims of her captor. Her memories of her past life became both a lifeline and a source of torment. She would cling to the image of her mother's face, trying to recall every detail, terrified that it might one day fade completely. She would remember the taste of her mother's cooking, the feeling of sunshine on her skin, the sound of laughter. These memories were precious, fragile treasures she would unwrap in the darkness, a reminder that she was once a person named Kesha, not just a prisoner in a box. Leonard was the god of this small, dark universe. He controlled everything. When she ate, when she could use the bucket, when she was allowed a few precious moments to stretch her cramped limbs in the dead of night. His footsteps above were the harbinger of her fate for the day. Would he bring food? Would he open the lid? Or would he simply leave her in the silence? This absolute dependency was the cornerstone of his control, a tool he wielded with meticulous, devastating precision. A life in the shadows was not a life at all. It was a suspended state of being, a long, dark, and seemingly endless wait for an end that never seemed to come. Leonard Price was not merely a captor. He was an architect of a twisted reality, and Kesha was its sole inhabitant. He understood, with a chilling and intuitive clarity, that true, lasting control was not achieved through physical force alone. It was achieved by capturing the mind. And so, he began to build a psychological prison around Kesha, a fortress of lies so elaborate and terrifying that it would eventually become more confining than the wooden box itself. It started a few months into her captivity. During one of the late-night intervals when she was allowed out, he sat her down at the small kitchen table. His demeanor was not that of a kidnapper, but of a grim, serious protector. He told her he was part of a powerful, clandestine organization, a secret society, or cult, as he called it. He claimed this group was a benevolent force, working to cleanse the world of corruption, but their methods were harsh and their rules absolute. "I didn't choose you by accident, Kesha," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The organization chose you. They have been watching you for a long time. They see a purity in you, a potential that must be protected from the sickness of the outside world." He explained that he was her guardian, assigned by the organization to keep her safe. The house, the box, the isolation, it was all for her own protection. The world outside, he insisted, was a place of immense danger, far more than she could ever comprehend. At first, Kesha resisted. The story was bizarre, nonsensical. But she was in a state of extreme vulnerability, her mind weakened by isolation, sensory deprivation, and fear. Leonard was methodical, patient, and incredibly persuasive. He began to introduce proof of the organization's existence. He would show her news clippings of unexplained accidents or crimes, claiming they were the work of the organization. Punishments meted out to those who disobeyed. He would leave strange symbols drawn on pieces of paper for her to find, telling her they were messages from the group's leaders. The most powerful and terrifying element of his deception was the threat to her family. "The organization is always watching," he would say, his eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving intensity. "They are watching your mother. As long as you are here, under my protection, she is safe. But if you try to escape, if you disobey, they will see it as a betrayal, and their punishment is swift and final. They will make her disappearance look like an accident. No one will ever know." This was the masterstroke of his psychological warfare. He had forged a direct link between Kesha's compliance and her mother's life. Her imprisonment was no longer just about her own survival. It was now a noble, terrible sacrifice she had to make to protect the person she loved most in the world. He had transformed her from a victim into a reluctant, secret guardian of her own family. The lie was reinforced daily. He would come back from his job as a security guard and share updates from the organization. Sometimes he would stage phone calls, speaking in hushed, coded language to an imaginary contact on the other end, ensuring Kesha could overhear. He created an entire mythology, complete with a hierarchy of leaders, a set of arcane rules, and a pervasive sense of being constantly monitored. Over time, the relentless, systematic brainwashing began to take root. Her reality was so limited, so completely controlled by him, that his narrative became the only one available to her. The world of Spelman College, of sociology papers and Stevie Wonder songs, began to feel like a distant, hazy dream. The world of the secret organization, of constant surveillance and hidden dangers, became her stark, terrifying reality. She stopped thinking about escape. The very idea was now linked with the image of her mother being harmed. Instead, she focused on perfect obedience. If she was quiet enough, if she followed every rule without question, she could keep her mother safe. Leonard had not just locked her body in a box. He had locked her mind in a web of deception so intricate and so horrifying that she had become her own jailer. The fear of the unknown monster outside was now greater than the fear of the known one sitting right in front of her. To the handful of people who lived on his quiet, tree-lined street, Leonard Price was little more than a shadow. He was a man who existed in the periphery of their lives, a familiar but ultimately unknown quantity. His house was neat, the lawn mowed, the hedges trimmed. It was a house that projected an aura of absolute, unassailable normalcy, a perfect piece of camouflage in a neighborhood where conformity was the unspoken rule. Leonard was what sociologists might call a gray man. He possessed no distinctive features, no memorable habits. He was of average height and build, with a face that was neither handsome nor unpleasant. It was a face you would instantly forget. He wore simple, practical clothes, khakis, polo shirts, a worn work jacket. He drove a common, American-made sedan, a model so ubiquitous it was practically invisible. His routine was as unremarkable as his appearance. He worked the night shift as a security guard at a downtown office building, a job that suited his solitary nature perfectly. He would leave his house just as the sun began to set and return in the quiet, pre-dawn hours. His neighbors would see his car pull into the driveway, see the brief flicker of a light inside, and then the house would fall silent again. He rarely interacted with anyone. He might offer a curt nod or a brief, tight-lipped smile if he passed a neighbor taking out the trash, but he never initiated a conversation. He didn't attend neighborhood barbecues or holiday block parties. When a new family moved in across the street, he did not come over with a welcome basket. This reclusiveness was not seen as sinister. It was simply interpreted as shyness or a desire for privacy. In a world where everyone was busy with their own lives, a quiet neighbor was often seen as a good neighbor. His wife, Dolores, was even more of a ghost. She was a homebody, rarely seen outside the house except for trips to the grocery store. She was a thin, pale woman with a perpetually worried expression. On the rare occasions she spoke to a neighbor, her voice was soft and hesitant, her eyes always darting away, as if she were afraid of being truly seen. The neighborhood consensus was that she was a timid, perhaps unwell, woman, and that Leonard was a patient, devoted husband who cared for her. This facade of boring mediocrity was Leonard's most brilliant and terrifying creation. It was a shield that deflected all suspicion. Who would ever imagine that behind the door of that meticulously normal house, a young woman was being held against her will? The very idea was so outlandish, so contrary to the peaceful, predictable rhythm of suburban life, that it would have been dismissed as fantasy. Monsters, people believed, looked like monsters. They were supposed to be wild-eyed, disheveled figures who lurked in the shadows. They weren't supposed to be the quiet man next door who separated his recycling and kept his lawn neat. Leonard understood this fundamental truth about human perception. He knew that people saw what they expected to see, and no one expected to see a monster in a beige polo shirt. The power of his invisibility was absolute. A police car could drive down his street and see nothing out of the ordinary. A census taker could knock on his door and be met with a polite but brief refusal to participate. He was protected by a powerful invisible force field of normalcy. Inside the house, this external perception was a key part of his control over Kesha. He would sometimes talk about his neighbors, describing their mundane lives with a kind of detached contempt. "They see me, but they don't see me," he would tell her. "They're all asleep. It's how the organization wants it. We move among them, unseen." This reinforced the idea that he was part of a powerful, invisible network, a secret world operating just beneath the surface of the one everyone else saw. He wasn't just an unseen neighbor. He was a secret agent, a guardian, and the master of a hidden, terrifying reality. The years in the box bled into one another, a long, seamless stretch of darkness and silence, punctuated by the carefully controlled moments of Leonard's presence. The physical confinement, while agonizing, eventually became a secondary aspect of Kesha's ordeal. The true prison was the one Leonard had constructed in her mind, a cage built of fear, dependency, and distorted logic. Her sense of self, once so vibrant and clearly defined, began to erode. The ambitious college student, the curious sociologist, the loving daughter, these identities became like old photographs, faded and distant. She was no longer Kesha Monroe. In her mind, she was a charge, a protected subject of the all-powerful, all-seeing organization. Her purpose was no longer to build a future, but simply to obey in order to survive and, more importantly, to keep her mother safe. Leonard's control was absolute because he had successfully rewired her understanding of reality. He was not her enemy. He was her sole source of information, her protector, and her only link to the outside world. He would bring her food, and with it, he would bring news. He would tell her of the chaos and danger out there, stories of crime and decay, which he framed as evidence of the world's corruption from which she was being shielded. He also controlled her emotional landscape. If he perceived any sign of resistance or sadness, he would remind her of the consequences. The organization is sensitive to negativity, he would warn. Your despair could be seen as a lack of faith in their protection. They don't tolerate weakness. You must remain strong and compliant for your mother's sake. This twisted logic forced her to suppress her own grief and fear, to perform a kind of detached, emotionless obedience. To feel too much was to endanger her family. Her own mind became a dangerous territory. Memories of her past life, once a comfort, were now a source of pain and a potential threat. To dwell on them was to invite despair, which could lead to punishment from the organization. So, she learned to push them down, to lock them away in a separate part of her consciousness. She lived entirely in the present. Her thoughts focused on the simple, immediate tasks of survival, listening for footsteps, conserving her water, remaining perfectly still and silent. The psychological prison had no bars, yet it was inescapable. Even on the rare occasions when she was out of the box, perhaps late at night while Leonard and Dolores slept, she never considered running. Where would she go? Leonard had convinced her that the organization's agents were everywhere. The friendly-looking mailman, the woman walking her dog, the police officer on the corner, any one of them could be a part of the network, ready to report her transgression. To step outside the front door would not be an act of liberation, but an act of certain doom for her and her mother. Dolores's role in this was one of passive reinforcement. Her silent, fearful compliance with Leonard's commands seemed to confirm his power. If this woman, who lived in the house freely, was so afraid of him and the organization, then the threat must be real. Dolores's fear became a mirror for Kesha's own, validating the terrifying reality Leonard had created. The passage of time became meaningless. Without daylight, without calendars, without seasons, there was only the long, undifferentiated now. Was she 21, 23, 25? She didn't know. The numbers had lost their significance. The only thing that mattered was following the rules. Leonard had achieved his ultimate goal. He had created a world in which he was the sole authority, the only source of truth. He had taken a bright, independent young woman and reduced her to a state of complete and total dependency. Kesha's body was in a box under the bed, but her mind was in a far more secure and complex prison, a place from which there seemed to be no possibility of escape. For the first few years of Kesha's captivity, Dolores Price was a model of silent complicity. She moved through the house like a phantom, her presence barely registering. She seemed to be a woman hollowed out, her will entirely subsumed by her husband's dark and overpowering personality. She prepared the meals that Leonard would take to Kesha, washed the clothes, and maintained the household in a state of meticulous order, all while pretending the horrific reality under her bed did not exist. Her silence was her shield, her survival mechanism. But a conscience, no matter how deeply buried, can be a stubborn thing. It can lie dormant for years, only to be awakened by the smallest of triggers. For Dolores, the change was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping erosion of the walls she had built around her own heart. It began with the sounds. She started to hear Kesha not just as a presence, but as a person. A muffled cough in the middle of the night. A soft, almost inaudible whimper after Leonard had been particularly harsh. These small, human sounds began to cut through the fog of her denial. They were reminders of the suffering that was taking place just a few feet beneath her as she slept. Then came the visual reminders. On the rare occasions when Kesha was allowed out of the box to clean herself in the bathroom, Dolores would catch a glimpse of her. She saw a young woman who was growing paler and thinner with each passing year, her eyes wide with a fear that never seemed to recede. She saw the ghost of the vibrant 19-year-old they had taken, and the sight began to stir something within her, a dormant sense of pity, of guilt. The turning point was a small, seemingly insignificant act. One winter night, the house was unusually cold. Dolores, lying in bed, could not stop thinking about Kesha in the box below, with only a thin blanket for warmth. An image of her own daughter, had she ever been able to have one, flashed in her mind. On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, she got out of bed. While Leonard snored softly beside her, she crept to the linen closet, pulled out a thick woolen blanket, and quietly opened the lid of the box. Kesha flinched, her eyes wide with terror, expecting a punishment. But Dolores simply laid the blanket over her, her touch surprisingly gentle. She didn't say a word. She just closed the lid and got back into bed, her heart hammering in her chest. That small act of defiance, of secret humanity, changed everything for Dolores. It was a crack in the dam of her fear and complicity. In the weeks and months that followed, other small acts followed. She began to leave an extra piece of fruit on Kesha's food tray. Once, when Leonard was out, she opened the lid of the box for a few minutes, allowing a precious hour of fresh, circulating air. These were not yet acts of rebellion, but of a reawakening conscience. A silent, one-sided relationship began to form between the two women. Kesha, conditioned to expect only cruelty or indifference, was confused by these small kindnesses, but they were also a lifeline, a flicker of warmth in her cold, dark world. They were the first suggestion in years that the reality Leonard had constructed might not be the only one. Dolores's internal conflict was immense. Her fear of Leonard was real and profound. He was a man capable of monstrous things, and she knew that if he discovered her secret acts of kindness, his rage would be terrible. But the guilt of her complicity had become its own kind of prison. The image of Kesha's suffering haunted her waking moments and her dreams. The glimmer of conscience was growing, slowly but steadily, into a flame. She was beginning to understand that her silence was not just a survival tactic. It was a choice she was making every day. The question that began to form in the deepest part of her mind was a terrifying one. Was she strong enough to make a different choice? The path of silent complicity was one of slow, moral decay. The path of defiance was fraught with unimaginable danger. For the first time in a long time, Dolores Price was starting to weigh the cost of both. In the Homicide and Missing Persons Division of the Atlanta Police Department, the storage room for cold cases was a quiet, somber library of tragedies. Rows of metal shelves held hundreds of manila folders, each one representing a life interrupted, a story without an ending. For Detective Lorraine, Rainey Baldwin, now a seasoned veteran with flecks of gray at her temples, this room was a place of professional humility and personal ghosts. Of all the ghosts that haunted those shelves, the one that lingered most persistently in her mind was Kesha Monroe. The Monroe file was thicker than many others, not because of an abundance of evidence, but because of the sheer volume of dead-end reports, fruitless interviews, and the yearly updates Rainey had insisted on adding herself. Every October, on the anniversary of Kesha's disappearance, Rainey would pull the file. She would read through her initial notes, look at the photograph of the bright-eyed 19-year-old, and feel the familiar, bitter sting of failure. The case had become a personal obsession, a puzzle she would mentally revisit whenever a spare moment allowed. The perfection of the crime was what haunted her most. There were no loose threads. It was a seamless act of malice that had left no trace. In her years as a detective, she had learned that most criminals, no matter how clever, made mistakes. They left a fingerprint, a fiber, a witness, but the person who took Kesha had been a ghost. By 1988, 6 years after the disappearance, technology had begun to change the landscape of police work. The first rudimentary computer databases were being implemented. allowing for more sophisticated cross-referencing of information. On a slow Tuesday afternoon, Rainey decided to run the key elements of the Monroe case through the new system, more as a training exercise than with any real expectation of a breakthrough. She entered the few details she had: the date of disappearance, the location, the victim's profile. Then, on a whim, she added a keyword search for any incident reports from that same week in 1982 involving a beige sedan. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack search she had done by hand years before with no success. The computer whirred and clicked for several minutes, and then a single, seemingly unrelated file appeared on the screen. It was a minor incident report, filed 2 days after Kesha vanished. A woman had called the police to report a suspicious vehicle parked on her street for several hours. The officer who responded had run the plates. The car was registered to a man named Samuel Pierce, who lived a few blocks away. He had told the officer he was having engine trouble and was waiting for a friend. The officer had noted that the man seemed calm and cooperative, and since no crime had been committed, the report was filed and forgotten. The car's color was listed as beige. Rainey's pulse quickened. It was almost certainly nothing. A coincidence. The city was full of beige sedans, but the location was less than 5 miles from where Kesha had been taken. And the name, Samuel Pierce. She ran it through the system. The man had no criminal record. He was a security guard. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He was, by all accounts, a nobody. She pulled up his DMV photo. It was a grainy, black-and-white image of a man with an average, forgettable face. She stared at it, trying to will it into a more sinister form, but it refused. He just looked like a man. It wasn't a lead. It was the ghost of a lead. A faint, tenuous thread that had been buried for 6 years. There was no evidence to link Samuel Pierce to Kesha Monroe. There was nothing to justify a search warrant or even a formal interview. All she had was a gut feeling, the persistent, nagging instinct of a veteran detective who knew that sometimes the biggest monsters were the ones who looked the most ordinary. She printed out the old incident report and the DMV photo of Samuel Pierce. She pinned them to the inside of the Kesha Monroe file. It was still a cold case. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like there was a name, a face, attached to the suffocating silence. The file was no longer just a memorial to a lost girl. It was now a target, waiting for the one piece of new information that would allow Rainey to finally take aim. The unforgotten file was now an active hunt, even if she was the only one who knew it. By the spring of 1989, the atmosphere inside the Price household had grown taut with a new, unspoken tension. The ground beneath the established order of their home had begun to fracture, hairline cracks spreading out from the epicenter of Dolores's reawakened conscience. The dynamic between Leonard, Dolores, and the captive woman under their bed had fundamentally and irrevocably shattered. Leonard, consumed by his own twisted world, seemed oblivious, but Dolores felt it every day. The secret acts of kindness she had been performing had forged a fragile, silent bond between her and Kesha, an alliance of shared suffering that was as dangerous as it was necessary. The breaking point for Dolores came not with a bang, but with a quiet, horrifying revelation. One evening, she overheard Leonard talking to himself while he thought she was asleep. He was pacing in the bedroom, muttering about the organization and its new directives. He spoke of Kesha with a chilling detachment, referring to her as the subject and the asset. Then he said something that made the blood run cold in Dolores's veins. "The council is growing impatient," he whispered to the empty room. "They say the subject's protection phase is nearing its end. Soon, it will be time for the final ceremony." Dolores didn't know what the final ceremony meant, but in the context of Leonard's dark fantasy, she could only imagine it was something terrible. Her husband, she realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, was not just disturbed, he was escalating. His fantasy was entering a new, more dangerous chapter. The fear she had always felt for herself was now dwarfed by the fear she felt for Kesha. The years of passive complicity fell away, replaced by a desperate, urgent need to act. She knew she could not overpower Leonard. She could not go to the police without implicating herself in 7 years of horrific crimes. There was only one path forward. She had to help Kesha escape. The planning was a terrifying, high-stakes chess game played out in secret. She began to communicate with Kesha through brief, whispered conversations through the lid of the box when Leonard was at work. "He's talking about a ceremony," she breathed one night, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not good. We have to get you out of here." For Kesha, this was a seismic shift in her reality. For 7 years, she had been taught that Dolores was part of the system of control. To suddenly hear her speaking of escape was disorienting, terrifying. Was it a test? Another one of Leonard's elaborate psychological games? "The organization," Kesha whispered back, her voice raspy from disuse. "They'll hurt my mother." "There is no organization, Kesha," Dolores insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "It's just him. It has only ever been him. He made it all up to keep you scared." This was the hardest part of the alliance. Dolores had to systematically dismantle the psychological prison that she had helped to maintain. Night after night, she would whisper truths to Kesha, reminding her of the world outside, of her real life, of her mother's love. She was trying to rekindle the spark of the old Kesha, the strong, intelligent young woman who had been buried under years of fear and manipulation. Slowly, tentatively, Kesha began to believe. The small acts of kindness Dolores had shown her over the past year had laid the groundwork. This wasn't a trick. This was real. They devised a simple, incredibly risky plan. Leonard had a weekly routine. Every Friday night, he would go out for 2 hours to play poker with some friends from work. It was the only time he was guaranteed to be away from the house. Dolores would have a 2-hour window to get Kesha out. The days leading up to the chosen Friday were filled with an almost unbearable tension. Dolores had to maintain her usual demeanor of quiet subservience, her heart pounding with terror every time Leonard looked at her. Kesha, in the darkness of the box, had to gather a mental and physical strength she hadn't used in years. She was no longer just a passive victim. She was an active participant in her own liberation. The alliance was forged. A pact made between two women who had been on opposite sides of a horrific reality, now united against a common monster. It was a dangerous, fragile partnership, built in the whispered conversations of the night. Their success depended on perfect timing, nerves of steel, and a desperate shared hope for freedom. The chosen Friday arrived with a suffocating sense of finality. The air in the house was thick with unspoken tension, a silence that felt heavier and more charged than ever before. Kesha, in the box, could hear every sound with a new, heightened awareness. The scrape of Leonard's chair at the dinner table, the clink of his keys as he picked them up from the counter, the final, decisive click of the front door as he left for his weekly poker game. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway was the starting pistol for a race against time. A few moments later, Kesha heard the frantic, hurried footsteps of Dolores. The lid of the box was lifted. The dim light of the bedroom lamp flooded in, momentarily blinding her. "Now, Kesha. We have to go now," Dolores whispered, her voice tight with panic. She reached in and helped Kesha, whose limbs were stiff and weak, to climb out of the prison that had been her world for 7 years. The simple act of standing on her own 2 feet was a challenge. The muscles in her legs screamed in protest. The world outside the box felt vast and dizzying. For a moment, she swayed, and Dolores grabbed her arm to steady her. "I have clothes for you," Dolores said, pressing a bundle of simple, clean garments into her hands. "And a bus pass, and some money. It's not much, but it will get you away from here." As Kesha quickly changed, her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The brainwashing of 7 years was not a switch that could be easily turned off. A part of her was still terrified of the organization, still convinced that this was a terrible mistake that would have dire consequences for her mother. But the other part of her, the part that Dolores had carefully reawakened, was screaming for freedom. Dolores led her through the house, a place Kesha had only ever seen in fragmented glimpses. It was shockingly normal, a tidy living room with a floral-patterned sofa, a kitchen with magnets on the refrigerator. The sheer banality of it was a stark, horrifying contrast to the secret it had held. At the back door, Dolores paused, her hand on the knob. She looked at Kesha, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of guilt, fear, and a fierce, protective resolve. "There's a bus stop 3 blocks that way," she said, pointing into the darkness. The number 16 bus will take you downtown to the main terminal. From there, you can get help. Don't talk to anyone until you find a police officer. Do you understand?" Kesha could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Go now. And don't ever look back," Dolores said, pushing the door open. The night air hit Kesha with the force of a physical blow. It was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, smells she hadn't experienced in years. She took a step onto the back porch, then another, her movements clumsy and uncertain. She was outside. The sky above was a vast, inky black, dotted with the impossible, brilliant light of stars. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful. She turned to look back at Dolores one last time, a silent acknowledgement of the woman who was both her captor and her savior. Dolores just gave a single sharp nod and quietly closed the door, leaving Kesha alone in the darkness. The walk to the bus stop was the most difficult journey of her life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound made her jump. She was convinced that agents of the organization were watching from every window. She forced herself to put one foot in front of the other, her body fueled by a primal, desperate surge of adrenaline. When she finally saw the reassuring orange glow of the bus stop sign, a wave of relief so intense it was dizzying washed over her. She sat on the cold, hard bench, clutching the small bundle of money Dolores had given her. A few minutes later, she saw the approaching headlights of the number 16 bus. It was real. It was happening. As she stepped onto the bus and dropped the coins into the fare box, she was just another passenger, another anonymous face in the city. But for the first time in 2,555 days, she was free. The moment was not one of triumphant joy, but of quiet, stunned, and terrified disbelief. The journey out of the box was over, but the journey back to herself was just beginning. The first few hours of freedom were a disorienting, surreal blur. Kesha rode the bus in a state of shock, her senses completely overwhelmed. The bright lights, the myriad sounds of the city, the simple presence of other people, it was all too much for a mind that had been conditioned for silence and darkness. She huddled in a seat at the back, pulling the hood of the sweatshirt Dolores had given her over her head, trying to make herself invisible. She got off at the downtown bus terminal, a chaotic hub of human activity that felt like a different planet. Following Dolores's instructions, she searched for a police officer. She found one standing near an information booth, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor. Walking up to him was an act of supreme courage. The voice in her head, Leonard's voice, was screaming that this was a trap, that this officer was part of the organization. She forced the voice down and spoke, her own voice a dry, raspy whisper. "I need help," she said. I think I've been missing for a long time." The officer initially looked at her with a mixture of pity and skepticism, likely assuming she was a runaway or someone struggling with substance abuse. But there was something in her eyes, a deep, profound trauma that couldn't be faked. He took her to a quieter part of the station and began to ask gentle questions, her name, her age, where she had come from. When she said the name Kesha Monroe, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. It was an old case, a ghost file from years ago, but the name still resonated in the collective memory of the department. The call was made, and soon Kesha found herself at police headquarters, sitting in a small, quiet room with a female detective. The detective's name was Lorraine Baldwin. Rainey looked at the pale, thin young woman in front of her, and then down at the old, faded photograph from the file she had pulled from the cold case archives. The vibrant 19-year-old in the picture was gone, replaced by this fragile, terrified survivor. But there was no doubt. It was her. "Kesha," Rainey said, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "It's really you. We've been looking for you for a very long time." And Captor Annie 816 now, the story that Kesha told, in a hesitant, fragmented voice, was beyond anything the veteran detective could have imagined. A wooden box. A secret organization. 7 years of captivity in a quiet suburban house. It was the stuff of nightmares, a story so bizarre and horrifying that it seemed impossible. But Rainey, looking into Kesha's haunted eyes, knew she was telling the truth. The most crucial detail Kesha provided was the name of her captor, Leonard Price. The name was not in the file, but when Rainey ran it through the system, she found him. And then she found the other file, the one she had pinned inside Kesha's folder a year ago. The minor incident report about a suspicious beige sedan, registered to a man named Samuel Pierce. "Are you sure his name was Leonard Price?" Rainey asked gently. Kesha nodded. "That's what he told me." Rainey had a sudden, chilling realization. She pulled up the DMV photo of Samuel Pierce and showed it to Kesha. "Is this him?" Kesha stared at the photo, and a small, almost imperceptible nod was her answer. The man had used a false name, another layer in his intricate web of deception. The search warrant was executed within hours. A SWAT team descended on the quiet, unremarkable house, expecting a potential confrontation. But there was no resistance. They found Leonard and Dolores Price sitting in their living room, watching television, the picture of mundane domesticity. The discovery of the wooden box under their bed sent a shockwave through the entire police force. It was real. Everything Kesha had said was true. The news broke the next morning, and the story of Kesha Monroe's 7-year ordeal became an instant national sensation. News vans lined the Price's street. Reporters clamored for details. The nation was gripped by a story that was almost too incredible to be believed. For Martha Monroe, the news came in a phone call from Detective Baldwin in the early hours of the morning. "Martha," Rainey said, her voice gentle. "We found her. We found Kesha. She's alive." The world, for Martha, tilted on its axis. The 7 years of silent, agonizing waiting were over. The hope she had so stubbornly kept alive had been rewarded. But her joy was mingled with a dawning horror as the details of what her daughter had endured began to emerge. The story that shocked a nation was, for her, a mother's worst nightmare brought to life. The arrests of Leonard and Dolores Price marked the beginning of a legal saga that would captivate and horrify the public. The facade of their quiet, normal life was torn away, revealing the monstrous reality that had been hidden within. The legal system, with its methodical and often slow-moving pace, now had the task of untangling 7 years of methodical psychological terror. For Kesha, the immediate aftermath of her escape was a whirlwind of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and hours of interviews with Detective Baldwin and the district attorney's office. She was physically weak, suffering from severe malnutrition and muscle atrophy. But the deeper injuries were the invisible ones. She was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, her perception of reality still warped by the years of brainwashing. She was terrified of small spaces, yet simultaneously frightened by open ones. She struggled to make eye contact and flinched at loud noises. Her reunion with her mother, Martha, was a moment of profound, heartbreaking beauty. When Martha walked into the hospital room, she saw not the 19-year-old she remembered, but a fragile, 26-year-old woman with the eyes of someone who had seen the unimaginable. They held each other and wept, a torrent of tears for the years that had been stolen and for the long, difficult road of healing that lay ahead. The case against Leonard Price was formidable. The physical evidence of the box, combined with Kesha's testimony, was damning. His defense team, however, immediately began to lay the groundwork for a strategy focused on his mental state, claiming he was a delusional man living in a fantasy world, not a calculated criminal mastermind. The case against Dolores was more complex. Was she a victim herself, a terrified woman acting under duress? Or was she a willing accomplice who had enabled her husband's crimes for 7 years? Her decision to finally help Kesha escape was a powerful mitigating factor, but it did not erase her years of complicity. She agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a lesser charge, a decision that would make her a key witness against her own husband. The media frenzy was relentless. The story was a chilling real-life thriller, and the public was fascinated by every disturbing detail. The term, "the girl in the box," became a national headline. Experts appeared on television to discuss Stockholm Syndrome, psychological manipulation, and the nature of evil that can hide behind a suburban facade. For Detective Baldwin, bringing the case to a close was the culmination of a 7-year-old promise she had made to herself and to Martha Monroe. She worked tirelessly with the DA's office to build an airtight case, ensuring every piece of evidence was meticulously documented, every detail of Kesha's story corroborated. She became a fierce, protective presence for Kesha, shielding her from the worst of the media glare and guiding her through the intimidating legal process. The preliminary hearings were a preview of the difficult trial to come. Leonard Price sat in the courtroom with a calm, almost serene expression, as if he were an observer rather than the accused. He still seemed to believe in his own fantasy, a man so lost in his web of deception that he could no longer distinguish it from reality. Justice, Kesha was learning, was not a single, dramatic moment, but a slow, arduous process. It was a series of small, difficult steps, giving her official statement, identifying her captor in a photo lineup, preparing to face him again in a court of law. Each step was both terrifying and empowering. It was the process of taking back control, of rewriting the narrative that had been forced upon her for so long. The world now knew her as the girl in the box, but she was determined that one day they would simply know her as Kesha Monroe, a survivor. The trial of Leonard Price was the final, public chapter of Kesha Monroe's ordeal. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, legal observers, and members of a public morbidly fascinated by the case. For Kesha, walking into that room and taking the witness stand was the single most terrifying and necessary act of her life. It was the ultimate confrontation, not just with the man who had stolen 7 years of her life, but with the fear he had instilled in her. Leonard sat at the defense table, looking at her with the same calm, proprietary gaze she remembered so well. It was the look of her guardian, a look meant to remind her of his power and of the rules of the world he had created. For a fleeting moment, the old fear, the conditioned obedience, washed over her. The voice of the organization whispered in her mind, but then she looked past him. She saw her mother, Martha, sitting in the front row, her expression one of unwavering love and support. She saw Detective Baldwin, giving her a small, encouraging nod. She saw the faces of the jury, 12 ordinary people waiting to hear the truth, and she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The prosecutor led her gently through her story. Her voice, at first a trembling whisper, grew stronger and clearer as she spoke. She described her life before, the abduction, and the long, dark years of her confinement. When she spoke of the wooden box, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was not just recounting events. She was transporting them into her reality, making them feel the suffocating darkness, the chilling silence. The most powerful part of her testimony was her description of the psychological prison Leonard had built. She explained the secret organization, the constant surveillance, and the terrible choice she had been forced to make between her own freedom and her mother's safety. She was dismantling his fantasy, piece by piece, in the sterile, logical light of a court of law. She was reclaiming her own mind. The cross-examination was grueling. Leonard's lawyer tried to portray her as a confused, unreliable witness, her memory distorted by trauma. He tried to suggest she had been a willing participant in a bizarre fantasy, but Kesha remained steadfast. "Was there ever a time you could have left?" the lawyer asked. "Physically, there may have been moments," Kesha answered, her voice clear and firm. "But mentally, no. He made sure I knew that leaving would have consequences for my family. He put my mother's life in my hands. That is not a choice. That is a cage." Her testimony was the heart of the trial. Dolores also testified against her husband, her voice barely audible as she recounted her years of fear and complicity, and her final, desperate act of courage. The combination of their accounts painted a devastating, irrefutable picture of Leonard Price's calculated cruelty. The jury's deliberation was short. The verdict was guilty on all counts. As the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, Leonard's calm facade finally cracked. He seemed not angry, but genuinely bewildered, like a man who could not comprehend why his world was being dismantled. But Kesha was no longer looking at him. A profound sense of release, of a final, heavy chain breaking, washed over her. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. Her voice, which had been silenced for 7 years, had been heard. And it had been believed. The story, for the public, ended there. But for Kesha, it was a beginning. The healing would be a long, quiet journey, taken one day at a time with the help of her mother and a team of dedicated therapists. There would be good days and bad days, moments of sunlight and shadows of memory. Months later, On a warm spring afternoon, Kesha stood in her mother's backyard, her face tilted up toward the Sunday. She felt its warmth on her skin, a simple, profound sensation she had dreamed of for years. She was no longer the girl in the box. She was not just a headline or a court transcript. She was Kesha Monroe. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt the undeniable, life-affirming promise of a future that was entirely her own. Her voice had been reclaimed, and now, so had her life.